Hello everybody, it's the Notorious Azorius back with another video for Magic the Gathering. Today we're going to be going over the top 10 modern decks you should be playing or need to be ready to play against. Recently there was the unbanning of Preordain last month, and the card has come back. It's been in a couple shells. It's not format warping. I think it's very healthy. I like the unbanning. The things I don't like will also be in here, and you'll get to learn all about it and what you should be ready for and have in your sideboard to be ready for this modern metagame. 10, we're going to start with Boros Burn. Boros Burn has been around since the beginning of time, I think. This deck isn't going anywhere. It's always going to be around. There's nothing like a good old lightning bolt to the face. Now, things have changed. The deck is a little bit harder to pilot now, especially with Omnath and, recurring fetch lands with Wrenn and 6. A lot of life gain from Solitude, cards like Blossoming Calm that are played, and Chalice of the Void is seen in a lot of sideboards. So, I mean, this deck is, kind of hard to pilot. It's not always going to be a linear strategy. Now, something that they recently did was they took out Eidolon the Great Rebel. A lot of people haven't been seeing success with Eidolon, and sometimes you find yourself in a spot where you're taking more damage from Eidolon than your opponent is. So they switched over to Roiling Vortex, especially since Scam is really popular right now. The Cascade decks are popular with Violent Outburst and Shardless Agent, and Hammer playing a bunch of free costing spells. Hardened Scale is doing the same thing. So Roiling Vortex also deals 1 extra damage on each upkeep. So long as it's staying around, prevents it from gaining life, and it's dealing a little bit extra damage. So I would say one of your weaker cards in this deck probably has to be Skewer the Critics. It is 3 mana. Rift Bolt's also a little bit weaker because Teferi is so popular. But this deck can actually pilot through a lot of hateful interaction, like counter spells or spell pierces, or even Chalice of the Void. Post board you got your Smash the Smithereens and your Wear Tears and Exquisite Firecraft to play through that. You've got your Sanctifier and Vex to deal with Scam, Deflecting Palm to deal with larger threats, maybe like a Murktide Regent or not an Amulet Titan, but what am I thinking? Primeval Titan, and your Path to Exile to deal with those large threats as well, maybe from Tron or Titan, maybe the Murktide as well. If you can't deal with an opposing Fury, if it's a 4/4 and you don't want to use a 3 damage spell, you can use that Path to Exile, and giving Scam an extra land normally doesn't hurt them too well since they're doing everything for free. So, number 10 is Boros Burn. Moving on to number 9. Number 9, I've got Living End. This deck has seen a lot of popularity over the last couple of years since MH2's release. Like I was talking about with Boros Burn, you got the spells with Violent Outburst and Shardless Agent to Cascade in the Living End. Normally you see them pitch Living End for Grief. Grief is it's another one of those free spells that you see in a couple different shells in the format at the moment. You get to do that with Subtlety and Force Negation. Typically what you'll see with a super linear strategy with Living End is, turn 3, pass, and then end step, Violent Outburst, Force Negation backup. And if you're able to pilot through that with counter magic, then they just go back to their turn and they Shardless Agent, and it's game over. Now the thing about this deck is that you don't always have to resolve a large Living End. You can, just resolve one that's giving you back a Waker of Waves or even a Striped Riverwinder with Hexproof. Maybe even a Grief that you evoked, and just get in for a couple damage each turn. This doesn't have to be a super explosive deck. I mean, it can be, and it's gotten more explosive with the Lord of the Rings cards, the Elephant and Genericent. Being able to Forest Cycle and Mountain Cycle, you get to play less lands. I've seen a couple lists play Lorien Revealed, but I don't see it very often. I didn't include it in here. I don't think it's necessary. I don't agree with it. I don't think it's good. You have enough cyclers as is, and I don't think you need to island cycle. I think you should be putting creatures in the graveyard rather than a sorcery. I just think that that's better. So, in the sideboard, each sideboard kind of varies, but you do typically see the Subtleties and the Ingot Chewers, Foundation Breakers, Endurance, Brazen Borrowers, Force of Vigor, Mystical Dispute, and Leyline of Sanctity. I think all this is pretty casual as far as what you typically see in these shells. So Endurance to deal with like the Mirror Match, or even against Yawgmoth or Scam, being able to pitch that in response to an Undying trigger, or bringing it back from the graveyard, or Brazen Borrower to deal with an opposing Chalice, or Force of Vigor to deal with Urza Sagas or opposing Chalices, Mystical Disputes to deal with opposing counterspells, Leyline of Sanctity to deal with Burn or Scam, Foundation Breaker to deal with artifacts and enchantments, Subtlety, to bring in for more creature-heavy matchups like 4-color Omnath or Scam, and then Ingot Shearers as well to deal with some more threats. So moving on to number 8, we got Hardened Scales. This deck has actually seen a massive resurgence with the One Ring. Some lists aren't even playing it, but a lot of people jam the One Ring in this deck. But I don't think that it's necessary. I think that with the new Ozolith being printed, and you get to play, all these old threats, even like with MH2 getting Zabaz was big, getting to move counters over Walking Ballista and Hangerback Walker, your two big ones. But sometimes you can just slam a Patchwork Automaton. Your opponent can't pay for the Ward 2 on top of dealing with it, and if they can, they're typically tapping out for it, and it leaves them very open to something that they really don't want to leave themselves open to. If you need to go a long game, you can always play your Urza Sagas and just make a bunch of constructs. I think that this deck is very well positioned at the moment. If you get both Ozoliths out, the deck can get out of hand very fast. The deck can be explosive. It's definitely one of those decks that you have to respect. And with Prismatic Ending being on the downswing and only seeing play in a couple of decks now, with Creativity being, kind of worked out of the format at the moment, Blue-White Control really isn't in right now. 4-color Control is really the only deck that's playing Prismatic Ending, and Prismatic Ending was one of the things that kept this deck in check, on top of March of Otherworldly Light, and decks aren't really playing that either. So with a lot of less exile effects that are very direct and easy to play early in the game, this deck has been able to come out explosive and really take its hold back in the top 8 slots in some tournaments and even in online challenges. So I think that this deck has really performed well, and in the sideboard you can see it's got Pithing Needles, Grafdigger's Cage, Void Mirrors, Damping Spheres, Nature's Claims, Dismembers, Haywire Mites, Soulless Jailers, and Bonecrusher Giants. I think all this is pretty typical. Dismember is going to allow you to deal with those scam threats, or even an early Ragavan that's not going to blow you out of the water. Haywire Mite to deal with opposing artifacts or enchantments that you need gone. Damping Sphere to deal with Amulet and Tron. Nature's Flame to deal with more artifact and enchantment hate. Void Mirror to deal with maybe the Cascade match. Grafdigger's Cage to prevent scam effects, so that way creatures can't re-enter. Pithing Needle to maybe stop an opposing Planeswalker, or you can catch somebody on Urza Sagas. I don't know why you would name Urza Saga, but maybe if you're not drawing yours, you're afraid to deal with it, maybe, whatever it might be. Bonecrusher Giant, a little bit more removal. It's a couple extra damage, and it's a 4/3 body. And then Soulless Jailer is preventing those undying effects and Graveyard Recursion. So I think Hardened Scales is in a decent place at the moment, and I think you can expect it to see some good results and stick around for a while. Moving on to number 7, this is kind of a hot take, but I really think that this deck is performing decently. This is one of the decks that picked up Preordained from the unbanning. Blue-Red Murktide was definitely shoved out of the format after the release of Lord of the Rings. A lot of decks really just took a dump on this by playing Orcish Bowmasters and getting to play Lorien Revealed. This deck couldn't really afford to play Lorien Revealed. It tried it, it failed. Scam being around has really hurt this deck. And so you haven't seen this deck around recently, but this deck really dominated the format for a long time. It was around for so long, and it dominated so many different challenges, so many different tournaments, and it had different shells. Shells that were playing Blood Moon in the main, or maybe Force in the main. Some lists that were playing Ledger Shredder, some that weren't, and some that were playing Brazen Borrower, some that weren't, even as one-ofs. But this is a decent list that I could find that I thought was, pretty good. I played Blue-Red Murktide myself for a long time, but the deck has changed so much that it's kind of hard to tell what's stock and what isn't. But this list seems to be pretty stock based off what I've been seeing. Some lists play 4 bolts instead of 3. This one's only playing 3. But I think Preordain is really what has allowed this deck to maintain a decent amount of card selection and be able to keep up with Scam in case Scam takes over, or even takes over more like it has already. So Preordain has really been helpful there. I don't know that I agree with Ledger Shredder being in. I've seen a lot of success from these decks without Ledger Shredder. I don't know if it's necessary, but I guess it just depends. This deck really does struggle against the graveyard decks because its immediate removal is just, burn damage. So I think the one-of subtlety can be very useful in buying time. I think this deck is the type of deck where you need to be countering the threats on the way down, but it is very, very prone to losing to graveyard strategy decks because it doesn't like to interact with the graveyard too much because they're also using the graveyard themselves to fuel for Delirium for the Dragon's Rage Channelers and Unholy Heats, and also for your Murktide regions. So you really don't want to do anything that's two-sided for graveyard hate, which is why they have to play Unlicensed Hearse. So it does become a bit dicey in situations like that. So that is why this deck really went on the downswing because, Scam and Yawgmoth and Living End really taking over for a while for Lord of the Rings. This deck just really took a big hit from that, and it couldn't keep up. But in the side of this list, looks like they're playing a couple copies of Dress Down, Blood Moon, Engineer Explosives, Unlicensed Hearse to deal with graveyards, Engineer Explosives to deal with maybe tokens like the Urza Saga tokens or the Cascade tokens. Blood Moon is just to lock up games, Dress Down to prevent maybe an Omnath from going crazy or from Scam from going crazy, Flusterstorm for a bit of counter magic, Spell Snare for counter magic for Run at 6, Stern Scolding to prevent those 2 power or toughness creatures from entering, Cast into Fire, Magus of the Moon is just another Blood Moon option as a creature instead, Obsidian Charmal to deal with Tron, and Fury to deal with some more immediate removal for multiple creatures. So I think that this deck isn't going anywhere, but I don't think it's going to see the top 5 anytime soon. Moving on to number 6, it's another deck that has been around since the beginning of everything, it feels like. This deck has never gone away. No matter what, this deck can just show up when it's necessary. And with the right pilot, this deck is going to be deadly. This list really hasn't changed much. The only difference is maybe what you see in the sideboard, depending on where the meta is moving. This deck picked up the One Ring. I don't think it's necessary to play the One Ring. It was picking up Karn the Great Creator. It just depends on the list that you're looking at. So I'm not really sure what's right and what isn't. I think that there isn't necessarily a stock list. I think that there can be many different lists that you can play. But as far as I'm concerned, this deck is still very powerful. You get to cast your early Primeval Titan off your Amulet of Vigor triggers from your Simic Growth Chambers or your Boros Garrisons, whatever it might be, slapping an early Dryad of the Elysian Grove, slapping your Arboreal Razor to get another land into play. There's so many different lines. This is by far, in my opinion, the most complicated deck to pilot in Modern. I don't think there's another deck that comes close. This deck has always been one that a lot of people are afraid to pick up. There are lines that are very linear, but there are also a lot of lines that aren't, so you really have to know what you're doing when you pick this deck up. It is very fun to play, but it is very complicated, and you got to know the lines, because if you take the wrong line at any point, it could cost you the game. Now, looking over in the sideboard, you've got Radiant Fountain, a little bit extra life, Bojuka Bog for Graveyard Hate, Cavern of Souls for Counter Magic, Tormod's Cryptmore Graveyard, Relic the same thing, Dismember to deal with those early threats, Force of Vigor to deal with opposing artifact and enchantments, Haywire Might, same thing, Hydroid Krasis is also for Counter Magic, Tireless Tracker to go long game, draw you some extra cards, Altered Ego, and Wormcoil Engine are in the side as well. I don't think that this deck is going anywhere. It's been around for a long time. I don't imagine it moving up to the top. I don't imagine it moving anywhere out towards the bottom either. I don't think it's tier 1. I think it's tier 2. But depending on the pilot, this deck can easily show up in a top 8, and it is a deck that you need to respect. Moving on to number 5. We got Mono White Hammer. There's not really much to say about this deck. The deck's been the same for a while. It's just, you get to play a Miria's Call. It's an extra land. It could be late game, being able to make some stuff. Ornithopter is typically your turn 1 play into maybe a Springleaf Drum, and then playing an Esper Sentinel or Sigarda's Aid. Sometimes you're holding back the Ornithopter to play around the removal. You also get to play Surge of Salvation and stuff like that to give yourself a bit of protection. You might want to lead on turn 1 Giver of Runes depending on the matchup. This deck has seen a lot of success. It's kind of moved back and forth on what it likes to play. It's still playing the one copy of Cauldron Complete and Nettle Cyst, and the one copy of Pithing Needle in the main. Urza Saga is a real powerhouse in this deck, being able to find, your Ornithopters, your Shadow Spears, Springleaf Drums, Paradise Mantles, Colossus Hammers, Pithing Needles, and your Gingerbrute. There's so many different lines of this deck. I would say 75% of it is very linear. The other 25% is not. I think that Mono White is better than Azorius at the moment, specifically because of where Scam is located and how many of those decks are playing Blood Moon. Blood Moon already locks this deck up a lot by killing its Urza Sagas and its Inkmoth Nexuses and turning them red. And by playing Azorius, you really leave yourself prone more by having to play those extra dual lands. So I think that this deck is a little bit more powerful in that sense, just being able to play the planes and, leaving itself vulnerable to maybe, say, 8 of its lands at max. I don't think that Azorius is the better shell, just in my opinion. I think that Mono White is where you should be at. That's just my opinion. Whether or not you agree, that's totally fine. But as I've said before, this deck is very powerful. I don't see it going anywhere. It's here to stay. It is a modern staple as a deck in its whole. In the sideboard, you got Solitudes for removal. Drannith Magistrate is going to be there for the Cascade matchup. Sanctifier and Vec for Graveyard Hate for Scam. Surge of Salvation is more of that protection. Nettle Cyst for just another 3-drop, maybe to play around Chalices, and Pithing Needle to deal with opposing one range and opposing Planeswalker threats and stuff of the sort. So, but yeah, that's Hammer. I don't think it's going anywhere. I think there's a lot of things that you can do with this deck that can be explosive, and it's definitely something that you need to respect. Moving on to number 4, we've got Team of Rhinos and Cascade. It's very similar to Living End. It's the other Cascade deck. This deck does change a lot more, though. It's not anywhere near as linear. It is one of those more interactive decks. You've got Fire Ice to deal with immediate removal or tapping down your opponent's threat, Fury to deal with opposing threats, Subtlety to prevent things from entering, Shardless Agent, Violent Outburst are your Cascade spells. This one plays main deck Mystical Dispute. This deck is also known for playing Gemstone Caverns, so even if you're on the draw, you can find yourself one land ahead. It's almost as if you're on the play anyway. I've seen a lot of lists trying out Commandeer. Commandeer can be very powerful, lets you gain control of literally any spell that you think you need to gain control of. You can just exile 2 blue cards to do that. It's got the One of Mutavault. The One of Mutavault has seen a little bit of success. Some people play more than one. I don't think more than one is necessary. The Dead Dawn is more immediate removal. Lorien Revealed is allowing them to keep up with island cycling or even late game draw spells. And of course the Crashing Footfalls for the 4/4 Rhinos. Now this deck doesn't necessarily have to play just Shardless Agent, Crashing Footfalls to win. This deck, like I said, is not as linear. It can play different lines. It can win with a Fury. It can win with a Subtlety. It could win with the Mutavault. And it could win with Arcane Proxy, casting Crashing Footfalls from the graveyard again. It doesn't have to be the Shardless Agent or the Violent Outburst. This deck can go the long game, and it can easily outgrind a lot of things, so you really have to respect this deck. It can be explosive, and it has enough interaction to go the long game. In the sideboard, this deck is running a couple Mystical Disputes and another Commandeer to keep up with the counter magic or even gaining control of more spells. Force of Vigor to deal with opposing artifact and enchantment threats. Magus of the Moon. And I thought it had a Blood Moon. It does not, just the Magus of the Moon, locking up your opponents. Endurance to deal with Graveyard Recursion, Graveyard Hate. Obsidian Charmwall for Tron, and Fury for more spot removal. This deck is very powerful, something to respect. And as I say for every other deck here, it's not going anywhere, and you need to be ready for it. Number 3, 4-color Omnath. Now, these lists do range from many different things. Now, when Lord of the Rings came out, this was one of the decks that definitely picked up the One Ring. And it's seen a lot of success. I mean, a lot. The only other shell where the One Ring has seen as much success is Tron. And in my opinion, I don't think Tron is near as powerful. 4-color Omnath is one of the decks that does struggle against the Tron matchup. But this deck is super powerful. Like, very powerful. It can outgrind just about anything in existence. If you've played against this deck, you can see what it does. You know what it can do, and it is miserable to sit across from. When your opponent goes turn 2 Wrenn and 6, turn 3 Teferi, turn 4 Omnath, it just feels like you've already lost the game. If you're playing Leyline Bindings and you're able to remove these things, it's okay, and there's other removal that you can use to deal with these threats, but it just feels like you're behind. But even if it's not turn 2 Wrenn and 6, it could be turn 2 Teferi with Delighted Halfling, or even turn 3 the One Ring with Delighted Halfling, and Delighted Halfling makes things uncounterable. So it makes it very, very difficult to be able to keep up with this deck, because it always finds ways to find lines that you don't think would be there. And if your opponent slams an Omnath and you're not killing that Omnath, then they go fetch land, play fetch land, gain 4 life, crack it, add 4 mana, cast the One Ring. You find yourself down, and it almost seems like it's impossible to win at that point. Not saying that it would be, but you do find it very difficult to come back from the game whenever your opponent is slamming all these big threats and there isn't anything that you can do about it. And that's the beauty about this deck, is that it can easily slam these threats and be aggressive, or it can play passively and just hold back the threats and wait to play them at the right time by holding up interaction with Prismatic Ending and Leyline Binding, and just interacting in instant speed with Teferi and preventing you from interacting in instant speed. Now, this deck is very, very good against the Cascade matchups, against the Living End matchups. It does struggle a bit more, but playing the Teferis really helps with being able to deal with those Cascade decks. And the Furies being able to deal with those threats, Solitude being able to deal like 1-for-1 threats, Omnath can deal with opposing Planeswalkers, Leyline Binding, Prismatic Ending for immediate removal, Wrenn and 6 is another 1 damage thing. This deck is very powerful. It's miserable to play against, and I really hope that it goes away at some point, but I don't think it will. Now, looking over at the sideboard, you've got Boseijus. This one already plays 1 Boseiju in the main. It's a channel land, being able to destroy things, so it plays around that counter magic. Chalice of the Void to deal with the opposing threats. You could play the Chalice on 1, or you could even play Chalice on 0 for the Cascade matchup. Dovin's Veto can't be countered, more counter magic. Endurance for that Graveyard Recursion, Graveyard Hate. Solitude, more 1-for-1 trades. Obsidian Charm, all for Tron. Fury for more removal. Elesh Norn for doubling triggers and preventing triggers, and Emrakul the Promised End for those long games where you need to be able to take your opponent's turn and gain control of things. This deck is very powerful, something to respect, and definitely something you can expect to be top-8ing a lot in the near future. Alright, number 2. Now this deck, Golgari Yawgmoth, this might be a hot take. I don't think it is. This is a deck that you need to be respecting, because this deck has been around since the release of Modern Horizons 1, and ever since then, it has only gotten stronger. They have found ways to continue to upgrade this deck. The only thing that can top this deck right now, in my opinion, is Scam, which we all know that Scam is number 1. If it hasn't shown up yet, you can assume that's number 1. But this deck is a really close second. Like, I've seen a lot of people do really well with this deck and be able to play that Scam matchup very well. But, the card that's allowing them to do that now is this Agatha's Soul Cauldron. At the start of the video, I talked about Wilds of Eldraine and how, a couple of cards have found their way into Eternal formats, but Agatha's Soul Cauldron is the one that you should be afraid of. Agatha's Soul Cauldron is the card that you can exile a card from a graveyard, and then when a creature card is exiled, and you get to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, and the creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on them have all activated abilities, or just, is it all abilities? Let's see. They have all activated abilities of all creatures exiled with Agatha's Soul Cauldron. Okay, so the reason why this is so good in the shell is because you get Grist the Huntertide, which says that it is a 1/1 insect creature in every other zone except the battlefield. So when it's in your graveyard, you can exile, with Agatha's Soul Cauldron, you can exile your Grist, and then you can put a +1/+1 counter on even an insect token that you made with Grist. And now that insect token has all activated abilities of Grist. So, yeah, that's a problem. And then you can also do the same thing with Yawgmoth. You can give your creatures the activated abilities of Yawgmoth, which is that pay 1 life, sacrifice another creature. So Yawgmoth doesn't even have to be in play for this thing to pop off with the 2 undying creatures. And now they're starting to play the 1 copy of Shieldred, so that way they can Court of Calling for Shieldred whenever they have the combo out already, and now they can go through their deck until they find that Zulaport Cutthroat or that Blood Artist. They can play that and then the game's over and there's nothing you can do. So this deck is definitely something you need to be respecting. It's not a joke. You sit down from it, and the Undying stuff, you really got to be ready for it. And with Prismatic Ending, really being gone right now, this deck is no joke. And now it gets to play Orcish Bowmasters, and it can deal with the One Ring, it can deal with opposing 1 toughness threats. It's just something you really got to respect to be ready to play against. In the sideboard, you've got Elven Chorus, the Filigree Silex, Fatal Push, Pylon, Force of Vigor, Thoughtseize, Spike Feeder, Magus of the Moon, Fulminator Mage, and Endurance. This deck is prepared to fight against everything. You can go against Tron, go against Forecolor, go against Scam, go against Control, go against Hammer, Hardened Scales, Jund, whatever it might be. This deck is there and it's ready, and it can play against just about everything. So you really got to bring the hate for it, make sure it's in your sideboard, and be ready to play against it, because it's definitely going to be one of those decks that you're going to encounter in tournaments, leagues, and in top 8s. And then number 1, it's, not really much to say about this deck. I don't like it. I don't think anybody does. There's people that pick up this deck and they 5-0 leagues easily because this deck is exactly what it says it is. It is a scam. You get to play the turn 1 Fury with the Undying Evil or the brand new Wilds of Eldraine, not dead after all. I really, really wish they wouldn't have printed that card, but it is what it is. There's just more for this deck to use. This deck also picked up Orcish Bowmasters. It gets to play the main deck Blood Moon. Orcish Bowmasters being able to ping your opponent's threats. It gets to, ping you whenever you get to draw cards with the One Ring, or even if you're playing Preordain or Considers or, Teferis, whatever it might be. Your Fable of the Mirror Breakers get turned off. You really don't want to draw those extra cards. Your Dauthi Voidwalker, it's, main deck Graveyard Hate, and it gets to play the one of Lightning Bolt. Lightning Bolt has cut back a little bit. It's just, as crazy as it sounds, Lightning Bolt is just not as good as it used to be. The card's still good, but just Scam doesn't need it. Just to do everything else. Just to disrupt your hand, just to deal all kinds of damage with Fury, being able to deal 8 damage at a time with the recursion spell. And even with Fable of the Mirror Breaker, if you get to flip Fable of the Mirror Breaker, if you have Grief or Fury, you can either clear the battlefield, or you can just draw step Grief again by making a copy of it. This deck is very unpleasant to play against. It's very annoying, and it's going to be a deck that you need to be ready to play against. Make sure you have stuff in your sideboard to deal with it. Cards like Stern Scolding are good. More Graveyard Hate like Endurance, Rest in Peace, and stuff of the sort. And just be ready for it. If they turn 1 Thoughtseize you, I wouldn't assume that it's Jund like it would be 5 years ago. It's definitely going to be Rakdos Scam. In the sideboard, they get to play more Blood Moons, so be ready for those. Leyline of the Void to deal with the Mirror Match, or even Living End. Chalice of the Void to deal with those Cascade matchups. Engineered Explosives to deal with Urza Saga tokens, and maybe even 1 or 2 CMC things. Pithy Needle to deal with opposing threats. Cast into Fire, Call Against Command, Hidetsugu Consumes All, and Shieldred. This deck is disgusting, and it is the product of everything that Wizards has done wrong in the last couple of years. It's just a compilation of everything that you don't want to play against or see in a deck. So, sadly, it's at the top. I wish it wasn't, but that's where Modern's at the moment, so you got to be ready to play against it. So, that is a biased opinion, and that's totally fine. I think a lot of people would agree with it. Maybe some of you won't. That's okay, too. But, anyway, thanks for watching, guys. I really appreciate you tuning in. Collector's Corner Gaming and Electronics is my local LGS. It's based out of Shelbyville, Indiana. If you are ever in the area and you want to swing through, be sure to do that. Thanks for watching, and go and support your LGS. Be sure to like and subscribe if you like the content you're seeing, and be ready for more of it to come out very soon. Thanks.